Please pray with me. Lord, take me where you want me to go. Let me meet who you want me to meet. Tell me what you want me to say, and please keep me out of your way. Amen. Please be seated. In the last few weeks, this busy time, our readings have all centered around John the Baptist and his role in the life of Jesus, and today is no different. But why? John the Baptist is really only on the scene for a very short time. We hear about him a little bit in the wilderness baptizing people. We hear about him meeting Jesus and proclaiming who he was. And we hear about him being arrested and being kept in the palace by Herod and eventually being beheaded there. And that's it. Those are the three main acts of John. So just why is he so important that at this critical time of the year, we would be reading him week after week? Well, let's see if we can figure that one out. We have been hearing about him in the Gospel of Luke, but now we get to hear him from a different source, the Gospel of John. And I'd like to just share a few bits about the origins of John's Gospel. And it's not to be confused with John the Baptist, for the Gospel is not named for him. While it is attributed to one of the original disciples, specifically John, the son of Zebedee, the Gospel never says who wrote it. And scholars consider it anonymous, just like the other three Gospels. But it's really not important to know who wrote it. And why is that, you might ask? Instead of being the work of just one single author, John is a bit more unique. It represents an entire community centered around Christ at the very beginnings of our church. I stress this because the New Testament, you see, is not an individualistic document with an author's name on the front cover. It's the church's book, written, preserved, translated, and interpreted by an entire community of faith at the earliest origins. And the Gospel of John came along to offer an interpretation, if you will, of the other three Gospels. It's unique in that sense. John, you see, tells us the why of the ministry of Christ. And the main purpose for John seems to be interpretation. By the time he was written, and this was the last of the Gospels to be written down, the majority of followers of Jesus were now Gentiles, and that's a big shift. They did not have the Jewish history that the followers reading the earlier Gospels would have had. So for me, John is so relevant because the majority of us do not have a Jewish perspective when we read the Gospels. Like those early Gentile believers, we too in attempt to interpret a faith conceived in biblical and Jewish terms to a secularized world. The Gospel of John provides this biblical model for the mission of the church in every generation to interpret it anew again, century after century. And John reflects the situation of the first Christian community sometime later in the early community's life, at the time when the parting of the ways between the Jews and the Christians had become clear and very painful. We can understand that painful parting between Christians and Jews of old. Even today, I think, we hear the echoes of it when we look at the acrimonious tearing apart between conservative interpreters of the Bible and those who follow the critical thinking method of Bible interpretation, especially when it came to the ordination of women and gays and lesbians in our own denomination, for instance. Or look at the wrenching that is happening within groups of Christians today, as some align themselves closely with politicians that others find not to be the models of Christian faith. Some find this so hard to reconcile, and they tear apart from those individuals. John is important in that it shares info not found anywhere else in any of the Gospels. It is important to note that it is from John's gospel that we get the fascinating and important detail that lets us know that Christ's ministry actually lasted for 3 years. The other gospels imply it only lasted 1 year. And here in today's reading, we have John the Baptist, who very much had his own disciples, his own followers, ready to die for him. There was a lot of confusion around John. Many people thought of him as the Messiah, called him the Messiah, wanted him to be the Messiah. Remember, these people were in turmoil. They were occupied by the Romans. They were taxed nearly to death. They were truly miserable people. And they read their prophetic writings over and over and over, where they were told a Messiah is coming, someone out of the ordinary. And John the Baptist certainly fit that bill. So people started pointing towards him. But John had no problem whatsoever letting people know that someone else greater than he was coming after him. John wasn't the light that was coming into the world, but he reflected the light, and he led a lot of people to Jesus. And in John, the gospel that is, there is a lot of language around the word. This is a little confusing. Y'all know how I love to dig into the meaning and interpretation of words at times, especially when it seems awkward or odd. Well, the Greek word for word is logos, and it has multiple meanings. And this is how we can go off with translations all the time. And people can take a definition and twist it to their own needs. Well, the Greek word can stand for speech, discourse, language, thought, reason, message, account, document, and book, to name but a few. Logos was a term used by theologians and philosophers both in Greek and in Hebrew. And in Hebrew, the word was an agent of creation, the source of God's message to his people through the prophets. So when we hear in the gospel reading the word being spoken about Jesus, well, he was an agent of creation, you see. In Greek philosophy, the word was the divine essence that held all things together. God's ideal pattern of creation. This is heady stuff, I know, but I love that God's ideal pattern for creation. God, his essence, holds everything together in the universe. We are all bound together. Our very bodies, our communities, our planet, our solar system, the entire universe is bound together by the essence of God. John's uses of the word also shows clearly that he is speaking of Jesus as a human being, but at the same time as the creator of the universe, the ultimate revelation of God, the living picture of God's holiness, if you will. And in sending Jesus to earth, God has revealed something new about himself. And John, the gospel that is trying so hard to interpret for us the history of the other three gospels, of the life of Jesus, of his facts and his where and his whys. And in the coming weeks, there will be opportunity to explore this more. There are so many fascinating stories of Jesus to come. And in the meantime, I want you to remember, though, about John the Baptist and his role in Jesus' life and in ours, to reflect the light of Jesus and to point the way to him. And if you think about it, isn't that our role as well? John the Baptist points us to Jesus. And in doing so, he sets this wonderful example of what we're supposed to be doing, pointing people in our lives to Jesus. Now, if you're looking for a New Year's resolution, if you haven't figured one out, or you've got room on your list for one more, consider John the Baptist and resolve this year to be a bit more like him and point people right here to Christ Church, where they can learn more and be in relationship with Jesus. Amen.